It was in the autumn of 2014 when I decided to spend a few days alone at a small rented cabin in the Lake District of Northern England. I was 32 at the time, and I had taken the trip mostly because I needed a break from the constant noise of work and the city. The cabin wasn't anything fancy, just a small wooden place tucked away on the edge of the fells, surrounded by damp grass, mossy stone walls, and endless rolling hills. It wasn't remote in the wildest sense, but it was far enough away from the nearest village that I felt properly cut off. There was no phone service, no Wi-Fi, and only a little wood stove for heat. I had brought enough supplies for 3 nights, along with a torch, a map, and a couple of old books. The weather was damp. The air carried that sharp cold you only feel in the north of England, and the clouds never seemed to stop crawling over the mountains. The first night passed quietly. I remember sitting at the small table by the window with a candle lit, writing a few things in my notebook while the wind pushed gently against the wooden walls. The silence was heavy but not unpleasant. I could hear the occasional drip of water from the roof as mist rolled through the valley. When I finally went to bed, the small room was chilly, but I slept soundly under the weight of several blankets. It was on the second night that I saw her. Earlier that day, I had gone out walking, following an old sheep path up into the hills until the cabin looked like a toy house far below. The ground was soft and wet, sucking at my boots. By the time I came back down, I was cold and sore, and I spent the rest of the evening warming myself by the stove. When darkness fell, it was the kind of darkness that feels almost solid. The valley had no streetlights, no glow from houses, no faint hum of cars in the distance, just thick black pressing against the windows. I stayed up later that night, reading. I remember the exact sound of the stove ticking as the fire inside settled. It was around 11 when I stood up to stretch and glanced out the window above the sink. At first I thought I saw nothing, just the black shape of the stone wall at the edge of the property and the pale reflection of my own face against the glass. But then, as my eyes adjusted, I noticed a figure standing near the wall. It was a woman. She was tall, though it was hard to judge exactly in the dim light. She wore a long coat that seemed too thin for the cold, and her hair looked wet, hanging down in clumps. She wasn't moving, just standing with her head slightly tilted toward the cabin. Her face was pale, though I could barely make out any features. I froze, thinking at first that maybe it was a trick of the darkness. I rubbed at the window, thinking it was condensation, but when I looked again, she was still there. I felt my stomach twist with unease. There was no reason anyone should be out here this late. The cabin was on private land. I hadn't seen a single person all day during my hike, and the nearest road was a good 20-minute walk away. My mind immediately went through all sorts of rational explanations. Maybe she was lost, maybe she was a hiker who had gotten turned around, but something about the way she stood so still, not even shifting her weight, didn't feel right. I shut the curtain, my hands trembling slightly. I sat back down at the table, but I couldn't focus on the book anymore. I kept glancing toward the window, listening hard for any sound outside. After 10 minutes, I couldn't resist. I got up slowly, eased the curtain back just an inch, and looked again. She was closer now, standing on the grass between the stone wall and the cabin, no more than 20 feet away. She hadn't made a sound. Her posture was stiff, her arms at her sides, and her head still angled as though she was staring straight through the window at me. I backed away, every hair on my body standing up. My instinct told me to grab my coat and leave, but where would I go? The path to the village was muddy and unlit, and I'd be walking blind with only my torch. The idea of stepping outside, knowing she was out there, froze me in place. Instead, I locked the door, even though the bolt looked flimsy, and sat on the bed with the torch in my lap. I didn't sleep at all that night. Every time I thought I heard movement outside, my chest tightened. But eventually, the faint light of morning began to creep in through the curtains. When I finally looked outside, she was gone. The grass was wet with dew, and the wall stood empty as if nothing had happened. I told myself I must have been imagining it, that maybe I was overtired from the hike. But the unease clung to me the entire day. I tried to distract myself by chopping wood, by walking just a short distance around the cabin, but I kept looking toward the wall, half expecting to see her again. As the evening approached, I debated whether to pack up and leave a day early, but stubbornness kept me there. I didn't want to admit to myself that I was rattled. That night, I barely used the lamp. I thought maybe if I kept the inside dark, I wouldn't draw attention. The cabin felt smaller somehow, like the walls were closing in. Around midnight, I heard the faint crunch of footsteps on the wet grass. My chest tightened instantly. I didn't want to look, but I couldn't stop myself. I pulled the curtain back a fraction and peered out. She was there again. This time she was standing right by the window, so close I could see her face clearly in the moonlight. Her skin was pale and lined, her eyes wide open, and her mouth slightly parted as though she were whispering something I couldn't hear. Her hair was matted against her cheeks, and her coat hung open, soaked through. The way she stood was unnatural, too still, her breath not visible in the cold air. I stumbled back, my torch falling onto the floor with a dull thud. My heart pounded so hard it hurt. I didn't know what she wanted, and I didn't care. I just knew I couldn't stay. I grabbed my backpack, shoved in what little I could, and pulled on my boots with shaking hands. I didn't dare go near the front door where the window was. Instead, I unlatched the small back door that opened toward the slope of the hill. I slipped outside, the cold air biting my face, and began moving as quickly and quietly as I could down the faint path toward the village. Every few steps I looked back, but the cabin stood silent in the dark. I didn't see her follow, but I couldn't shake the feeling that she was nearby, watching. It took me nearly an hour to reach the main road, stumbling in the mud with my torch beam bouncing weakly ahead of me. When I finally saw the glow of a distant farmhouse, I felt the first wave of relief. By the time I made it to the village, dawn was breaking, and I found a small inn where I stayed until I could arrange transport back home. I never went back to that cabin. Later, I learned that the property had been vacant for years, often rented out to walkers and tourists looking for a cheap escape. No one ever mentioned anything about people wandering around, no strange stories tied to the place. It was just a quiet cabin in the hills. But I know what I saw, twice, and the way she moved, the way she watched, still sits heavy in my memory. I can't explain who she was or what she wanted, but I know I'll never forget the sight of that pale face at the window, the way it froze me in place. I had gone there looking for quiet, for peace away from the city. Instead, I found something that reminded me just how vulnerable you are when you think you're alone, cut off from everything. And even now, years later, every time I see a dark window at night, I can't help but expect to find her face looking back at me. I was 34 when I decided to spend a few days alone in a small cabin that sat right on the edge of an old graveyard in northern Arkansas. The cabin wasn't meant for visitors anymore. It used to belong to a groundskeeper who worked the cemetery back in the 1960s. Since then, it had been left to rot, though hunters, drifters, and the occasional wanderer sometimes used it as shelter. A man I knew from work mentioned it to me after hearing I liked camping in unusual places. He told me it wasn't locked, that the roof still held out rain, and that it sat in a strange, quiet spot. That was enough for me to get curious. I drove out there in late October of 2013, during a stretch of dry, cold days when the trees had lost most of their leaves and the air smelled of frost. The directions I'd been given were vague, and I ended up parking my old Chevy pickup about a mile away from the site on the side of a rough dirt road. I had to hike through dead brush, stepping over broken stone walls and weaving around patches of brambles, until I finally saw the graveyard fence. just an old chain link rusted orange with big sections bent down. Beyond that fence were rows of leaning stones, cracked and faded with moss growing in the letters. The whole place looked like no one had cut the grass in decades. The cabin sat a little higher up the slope on the far end, almost swallowed by bare oak trees. Its boards were gray and warped, the roof sagged but held, and one of the shutters hung down at an angle. There was a smell of damp wood and dirt even before I pushed the door open. The inside was small, one room with a rotted bed frame against the wall, a broken stove in the corner, and shelves nailed crookedly into the logs. The floor was uneven but mostly solid. I dropped my pack and decided to stay. I laid out my sleeping bag on a clean tarp, set up my lantern and a few supplies, and made a fire outside in the stone ring I built near the door. The first day wasn't bad. The sun went down early behind the trees, and as the shadows stretched over the rows of gravestones, I felt that deep stillness you only get in forgotten places. By the time it was fully dark, the only sounds were the crackle of my fire, the rustle of dry leaves, and the distant call of a barred owl. The graveyard itself looked different in the dark. Shapes of stones stood like crooked teeth, some so short they almost disappeared into the ground, others tall and black with age. The fence barely marked the edge anymore since the woods had grown up through it. I tried not to think too hard about the names out there, about who they were and how long they had been gone. I told myself it was just land, just stone, nothing more. Still, as the night stretched on, I noticed little things that set me on edge. The firelight would throw long shadows across the stones, and sometimes I thought I saw a figure among them. But when I looked, it was only a broken marker or a stump. The air was so still that every snap of a twig carried sharp, and sometimes I couldn't tell if it came from the woods or just from my firewood pile shifting. I barely slept that first night. I lay in the cabin with the lantern turned low, staring at the cracks in the ceiling while the silence pressed in. Every so often, a small noise outside would jerk me awake again. At one point, I thought I heard light footsteps through the leaves, not close but steady, pacing out beyond the graveyard fence. They moved slow, then stopped altogether. I waited for them to start again, but the silence that followed was worse. The next morning, I walked the edge of the graveyard. I found no tracks, just piles of leaves and old stone markers tilting into the earth. Some of the headstones had no names left, the letters eroded smooth. One had fallen flat, split right down the middle. The longer I looked, the more it felt like the place was caving in on itself, sinking into time. I spent that day gathering more wood and trying to settle my nerves. I cooked canned beans on my little stove and sat on the cabin step as the sun went down. The cold cut deeper that night, and by the time darkness set, I had a larger fire built up. I kept close to it, the heat warming my front while my back stayed chilled. That was when I started noticing movements I couldn't explain. Not people, at least not clearly. Just the sense that something was shifting between the stones when I wasn't watching. I'd catch the tail end of a shadow moving behind a row, or hear the crunch of leaves in a place I wasn't looking. I kept telling myself it had to be deer, raccoons, or maybe even a stray dog. The woods were thick enough for plenty of animals. But the longer I listened, the more it sounded deliberate, as if something was keeping the same distance from me no matter how I turned. I didn't leave the fire much that night. I sat with my flashlight in hand, my eyes burning from staring too hard into the dark. I thought about packing up and hiking back to the truck, but I told myself it was just nerves, that I had come out here for the challenge. Sometime past midnight, I heard a sound that froze me. Not the shuffle of an animal, not the fall of a branch. It was the sound of metal clinking lightly, almost like chain links brushing together. It came from the far corner of the graveyard, near where the fence was collapsed. I held my breath and listened. The sound came again, slow and soft. I shone my flashlight, but the beam only lit empty stones and brush. I stayed awake the rest of the night, waiting for the noise to come back. but it didn't. By morning, I was exhausted, my eyes gritty, my hands shaking from the cold. I walked that corner of the graveyard again and found nothing but a piece of bent fence swinging loosely. Could have been that. Maybe the wind had caught it, though the air had felt still. I thought about leaving that day, but stubbornness kept me there. I had food left, wood piled up, and I didn't want to admit I was scared of nothing. So I stayed one more night. That was the night everything came together in a way I couldn't brush off. After dark, I stayed inside the cabin, lantern lit, door shut. I heard footsteps again, this time heavier, slower, circling the cabin itself. I knew then it wasn't animals. The steps crunched the leaves close against the walls, moving around from one side to the next. I sat frozen, gripping the small hatchet I had in my pack, listening as whoever it was paused at the door. The wood creaked softly, like weight pressing against it. The steps didn't break in. Instead, they moved back out toward the graveyard. For hours, I heard them pacing between the stones, steady, unhurried. My nerves stretched thin. I knew I wasn't imagining it anymore. Someone was out there, watching, waiting. When dawn finally came, I didn't waste time. I packed everything fast, slung my gear over my shoulder, and walked straight out. I didn't even look back at the cabin. I crossed the graveyard quick, my boots crunching the frost-hard ground. For a moment, I thought I saw a shape standing still among the stones, just tall enough to be a man. But when I blinked, the light changed, and it was only a marker. The hike back to the truck felt endless. Every crack of a branch behind me made my heart race. When I finally saw the dirt road and my pickup sitting there, I felt my legs almost give out with relief. I loaded my gear and drove away without stopping. I never went back to that place. I don't know if it was someone living out there, hiding in the woods, or just passing through. Maybe it was someone who didn't want me there near the graves, someone who thought that patch of land belonged to them. All I know is it wasn't animals and it wasn't my imagination. Those footsteps, that pacing, that weight against the door, those were real. The cabin still stands, I'm sure, but I don't ever want to see it again. Some places carry a silence that isn't empty but watchful, and that graveyard cabin is one of them. I left it behind, and I'll never go back. I remember the first time I drove out to that cabin. It was the summer of 2014, though it felt like late fall with how cool the air was in the mornings. I had taken a week off from work, needing quiet away from people, away from noise, away from everything. I brought my dog, a brown lab mix named Clyde, because leaving him back in the city with neighbors wasn't something I trusted. He was already 8 years old then, but still strong, still alert, the kind of dog who never let his eyes rest too long on one place if he thought something was wrong. The cabin was in the northern part of Michigan, tucked back off a long dirt road that turned into more of a trail than an actual road once you got past the first few miles. The cabin itself wasn't much. One small room, a wood stove, a broken screen door that banged in the wind, and a shed out back where someone had left rusted tools decades ago. The property stretched out into forest in every direction. No cell service, no close neighbors, no traffic. At first, the silence felt like a blessing, but as hours passed, it started pressing down in a way I hadn't felt before. The kind of silence where even the smallest twig breaking feels like a shout. I spent the first day stacking wood, sweeping out the dust inside, and trying to make it feel like a place I could settle in for the week. Clyde wandered around the edges of the clearing, nose down, tail stiff, marking his ground. Every so often, he would stop and stare into the trees, ears pointed, body leaning forward. I told myself it was just deer or raccoons. It had to be. That land was thick with wildlife, and he wasn't used to it after years of city life. But even then, something about the way he froze unsettled me. That night, a storm rolled in. Heavy rain hit the tin roof so hard I could barely hear my own thoughts. The wind pushed through the cracks in the walls, and the cabin moaned like it was alive. Clyde curled up at the end of the cot, breathing steady, though every once in a while he'd lift his head like he was listening for something I couldn't hear. I kept the lantern burning longer than I needed, just to keep shadows from pressing too close. Sleep didn't come easy. The next morning, I found footprints in the mud near the side of the shed. They weren't mine. They weren't shaped like boots either. Bare feet, wide, flat, with toes pressed clear as if someone had been walking slowly in the rain. I crouched down and stared at them longer than I should have, trying to make sense of it. They weren't fresh, but they weren't old either. The edges were still sharp. Clyde sniffed them, his tail low, body tense, and gave a low growl that rumbled deep in his throat. I tried to reason with myself. Maybe a hunter had passed through. Maybe kids messing around. Maybe I was just overthinking because of how isolated I was. Still, the idea of someone walking barefoot out here made my skin crawl. Couldn't shake it. That day dragged on, and the woods seemed louder somehow, every crack and snap of branches echoing. Clyde stayed close to me, which wasn't like him. Usually he'd wander, but now he rarely left my side. At dusk, I heard something move behind the cabin, slow, heavy steps through wet leaves. Clyde bolted up, barking hard, teeth bared, his whole body trembling like a wire pulled tight. I grabbed the heavy flashlight I kept by the door and stepped out onto the porch. The beam cut through trees, bouncing off trunks, but I didn't see anyone, just thick woods and darkness settling in fast. The noise stopped when the light swept that way, which was somehow worse than hearing it. Clyde barked until his voice cracked, then stood staring, hackles raised. I stayed outside longer than I wanted, flashlight shaking in my hand, until the cold forced me back in. That night was worse than the first. The rain had cleared, so every sound carried farther. I could hear branches snapping out in the woods, not from the weight of water, but like someone deliberately stepping on them. At one point, Clyde jumped off the cot and pressed his nose against the door, growling low and steady for nearly half an hour. I sat up the whole night, staring at the door, waiting for something to push through. Nothing ever did. By the third day, I hadn't slept more than a few hours. My nerves were stretched thin. I found more footprints behind the shed, this time closer to the cabin, almost circling it. Always barefoot, always moving closer. I tried to keep calm, but my hands shook while I tried to make coffee on the stove. Clyde wouldn't leave the door. He paced, restless, whining, snapping his head toward the window every time a shadow shifted outside. Late that afternoon, I was cutting firewood when I heard Clyde barking wildly from inside the cabin. I dropped the axe and sprinted back. He was at the window, teeth bared, tail stiff, barking at something just beyond the clearing. I grabbed the flashlight again and shined it out there, but just like before, nothing. Trees, silence, empty ground. But his reaction wasn't fake. He had seen something. The worst night came after that. I didn't even try to sleep. I sat up with the lantern low, listening. Clyde pressed against my leg like he couldn't stand being even a foot away. Just past midnight, I heard slow steps outside the porch. Not running, not stumbling. Slow, measured, like someone was circling, making sure I knew they were there. The boards on the porch creaked under weight. My chest felt tight, my heart hammering so hard it hurt. I held Clyde back as he barked and lunged toward the door. I aimed the flashlight at the cracks in the wall, but I couldn't see out. I thought about shouting, thought about firing a warning shot, but I didn't want to give away any more of myself than I already had. The steps lasted minutes, long, dragging minutes where I couldn't breathe. Then they faded into the woods. The next morning, I found the porch boards muddy, smudged with those same wide, bare prints. Whoever it was, they had stood right at my door, inches from where I sat, inches from Clyde. My hands shook as I packed my gear. I didn't even care about leaving food or supplies behind. I shoved everything into the truck as fast as I could. Clyde stayed in the cab, watching me, whining whenever I was out of sight. The drive out was a blur. Every shadow on the trail looked like someone standing. Every sound in the trees made me press harder on the gas. I didn't stop until I was 20 miles down the highway, where the signal bars returned to my phone and the world felt connected again. I never went back to that cabin. I sold it that fall cheap without setting foot on the property again. I still think about those footprints, about the way Clyde reacted, about the steps on the porch that night. Whoever was out there, they never tried to break in, never spoke, never showed themselves fully. They just circled closer and closer, letting me know I wasn't alone. Clyde lived another 3 years after that, and every time he growled at the door in the city, even if it was just at the mailman, my stomach knotted with the memory of those nights. I learned something out there. Silence isn't always peace, and being alone in the woods doesn't mean you're really alone. I had been wanting a quiet place to get away from everything, and in the spring of 2014, I rented a small cabin in northern Arizona, near the edge of Navajo land. I was 26 at the time, and I had been working long shifts at a warehouse back in Phoenix. My body felt worn down and my head was heavy from noise and stress, so I thought being alone in the woods would calm me. The cabin itself was plain and a little run down, but it had what I needed. A single room, a stove, a wood-burning fireplace, and an old bed with a thin mattress. The closest town was about 40 minutes away by car, and once I left the paved highway, I had to follow a long dirt road to get to the property. There were no neighbors in sight. When I first arrived, the silence felt like a gift. The only sounds were the wind pushing through the tall junipers, the occasional crow overhead, and the crunch of gravel under my boots. The air was cooler than Phoenix, sharp and dry in my lungs. I unpacked a few supplies, cans of food, a bag of rice, bottled water, and a small cooler with some meat I had brought. I had also carried my rifle and a box of rounds, not because I expected trouble, but because it felt right to have it. Out here, things were far from help if something went wrong. The first day passed without anything strange. I walked the area, checked the perimeter, and found some old animal tracks near a wash that ran behind the cabin. At night, I lit the fireplace, cooked rice and beans, and sat by the window with only the dim light from my lantern. The stars outside were bright, so many they looked like dust scattered across black glass. I fell asleep easily, listening to the quiet crackle of firewood. The second night was when I noticed the first thing that made me uneasy. I had gone to bed around 10, and sometime later, I woke up without knowing why. The fire had died out, and the cabin was nearly black, just faint moonlight spilling through the small window. I lay still, trying to figure out if a sound had woken me. After a moment, I heard something faint outside. It was not close, but it was distinct, a dry shuffling, almost like footsteps dragging across the dirt. Then silence again. I stayed in bed, my ears straining. A minute later, I heard it again, this time sharper, like a heel crunching a patch of gravel. I sat up, heart thumping, and reached for the rifle leaning against the wall. My hands were clumsy in the dark, but I held it across my lap and waited. After maybe 5 minutes, nothing else happened, and the night settled again into stillness. I told myself it could have been a deer or even a stray dog. Out here, animals wandered at night all the time. I stayed awake until the gray light of dawn, listening and watching the thin curtains ripple in the draft. The following day, I walked around the cabin to check for prints. The ground was firm in most spots, but in a patch of loose soil near the edge of the road, I saw something that looked like a footprint. It was elongated, not deep, but it looked like the shape of a bare human foot. The toes were visible. It was strange because the nearest house was miles away, and the nights were too cold for anyone to be walking around without shoes. I stared at it longer than I should have, then walked away, trying to convince myself it could have been old or distorted from erosion. That night, things escalated. I had been sitting by the fire, writing in a small notebook, when I heard it again, the shuffle outside. Only this time it was closer, right against the side of the cabin. The wall creaked faintly, as if something brushed against it. My chest tightened and I set the notebook aside. I turned off the lantern and sat in the dark, the rifle against my shoulder, staring at the window. The noise came again, a slow dragging sound, circling the cabin. Gravel popped under pressure, then silence, then the faint crunch of something moving again. I felt sweat gather on my forehead, even though the room was cool. The sound stopped near the back, by the wash, and I strained to hear more. Then I heard a noise I still can't shake from my mind. A low, strained imitation of a cough. It wasn't a clean human cough, but it was close enough that my body froze. It was as if someone outside was trying to mimic the sound but couldn't get it right. My stomach twisted hard. I stayed like that for nearly an hour, not moving, just listening. Eventually, I heard nothing more. I didn't sleep that night. When the morning sun finally lit the cabin, I opened the door and walked the perimeter again. Near the back wall, I found more prints. Not just one, but several scattered in different directions. They were all bare, all human-looking, and all pointing toward the wash. My throat was dry as I studied them. The edges were sharp, meaning they were fresh. I thought of packing up right then, but stubbornness kept me there. I told myself it had to be some local messing with me, or a drifter cutting through the land. Maybe someone living rough in the desert, not uncommon in parts of Arizona. I decided I'd stay one more night and keep watch. That evening, I set up my chair near the window with the rifle across my lap. I left the lantern off and sat in the dark, staring out into the yard lit by the thin silver of the moon. Hours dragged by. My eyes burned from the strain of staying open. Then, near 2 in the morning, I saw it. Something moved at the edge of the tree line, just beyond the wash. At first, it looked like a man hunched forward, shoulders narrow, arms hanging oddly low. He or it stood still, watching the cabin. The hair on my arms prickled. The shape swayed slightly, shifting weight from one leg to the other, but it never stepped closer. I held the rifle tight and didn't blink. After what felt like forever, the figure turned and moved along the tree line, not toward me but parallel, keeping distance. Its movements were jerky, almost awkward, but steady enough to show intent. I didn't sleep at all that night. By sunrise, I had made up my mind. I couldn't stay there another night. Whatever it was, whether a disturbed person, some addict wandering the woods, or someone deliberately trying to frighten me, it was too much. I packed my things quickly, stuffing food and clothes into bags, dousing the fireplace and loading the car. My hands shook as I locked the cabin door behind me, even though there was no real reason to. On the drive back, as the dirt road curved toward the main highway, I caught one last thing in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the road, far behind me, a figure stood half hidden in the trees, thin, bent, watching. I pressed the gas harder until the trees blurred past and the paved road came into view. When I finally reached town, the noise of traffic and the sight of people moving normally felt unreal. I stopped at a gas station, sat in the car for a long time, and tried to slow my breathing. I wanted to tell someone what I had seen, but I knew it would sound wrong. If I said a man was out there, barefoot, imitating noises and circling my cabin, it would only invite disbelief or laughter. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. I never went back to that cabin. I didn't ask for a refund, didn't explain anything to the owner, and didn't care. To this day, I don't know who or what it was. A man living wild, Someone dangerous, someone broken, or just a stranger playing games with me. All I know is it wasn't a ghost, it wasn't a monster, and it wasn't some fairy tale creature. It was real, it was human, and it was enough to drive me out of those woods for good. I was 27 when I first stepped into the old cabin deep in the woods of northern Idaho. It was the fall of 2013, early October, when the air carried that dry chill that meant winter wasn't far away. I had been hiking alone for most of the day, following old logging roads that weren't even marked on most maps anymore. My plan wasn't anything special. I just wanted to explore, maybe camp a night or two away from people. I liked the feeling of being on my own where no one else was around. It made me feel free, but it also had a way of pulling out a kind of nervousness in me that I usually buried under normal day-to-day life. The logging road I was following narrowed until it was more of a path, then eventually disappeared completely into underbrush and pine needles. I stopped to drink water and thought about turning back, but something caught my eye through the trees. It was faint, like the straight edge of a roofline peeking through branches. At first I thought it was just my eyes making shapes out of shadows, but when I moved a little closer, I saw that it was real. A cabin, old and gray, sitting crooked in a small clearing. I walked toward it slowly, crunching over sticks and leaves. The place looked like it hadn't been lived in for decades. The roof sagged in the middle, shingles curling upward. The walls were gray and splintered, boards pulling apart where the nails had rusted away. The windows were covered in grime so thick they looked almost painted over. There was an old chimney on one end, bricks crumbling with moss growing between them. When I reached the front steps, I stopped. They were soft under my boots, creaking, almost bending with my weight. The front door stood slightly open, like it hadn't latched in years. I pushed it with the edge of my hand, and it swung in slow and stiff, groaning on its rusted hinges. Inside, the air was stale, filled with the smell of dust, wet wood, and something sharper I couldn't place at first. It was the smell of rot, like old animals or damp earth that had been shut away too long. The cabin was one main room with a small loft above, reached by a ladder nailed to the wall. A broken wood stove sat in the corner, the pipe running up through the roof. There was a table with two chairs, one knocked over, and a shelf lined with glass jars. Most of them were empty, but a few still had cloudy liquid in them, sealed tight with rusty lids. A cot leaned against the wall, the thin mattress eaten by mice or moths. Everything had a layer of dust so thick it muted the colors of the wood and cloth. I walked further inside, my footsteps muffled on the warped boards. Every sound I made echoed strangely, as if the cabin swallowed it instead of letting it fade out naturally. I tried to tell myself it was just acoustics, just the way the walls and roof closed in. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that the place had been left in a hurry, abandoned without care. I went over to the table and ran my fingers along the surface. Dust came away on my hand, but beneath it were scratches. At first, they just looked like random marks, but as I leaned closer, I realized they were deliberate, straight lines carved deep, over and over again, like someone had been tallying something. Hundreds of lines grouped in sets of 5, covering half the tabletop. The air felt heavier then, though I knew that didn't make sense. My chest felt tight, and I kept glancing at the door behind me, making sure it was still open. My instincts were telling me I shouldn't be inside, that the cabin wasn't safe, not in a physical way, but in some deeper, unsettled way. I decided to leave, but before I turned, something else caught my attention. Near the far corner of the cabin, partly hidden behind the cot, was a dark patch on the floor. I stepped closer and crouched down. It wasn't just discoloration from water or mold. It was a stain, dark brown, spread in a wide, uneven circle. It had seeped into the boards. My stomach tightened when I realized what it likely was. Old blood, soaked into the wood so long ago it had turned almost black. I backed up quickly, bumping into the cot, which tipped and fell with a hollow thud. The sound rang louder than it should have, and for a second I froze, listening. The forest outside was silent. No wind, no birds, nothing. It was like the entire clearing had gone still around me. I grabbed my pack and forced myself to walk out, down the steps and back onto the ground. My legs felt unsteady, and I kept glancing behind me as if someone might step out of the doorway. I made it about 50 yards into the trees before I stopped to breathe. My heart was pounding so hard I felt it in my throat. I looked back, and the cabin was just barely visible between the trunks, leaning in its crooked way, the door still hanging open. The smart thing would have been to leave the area completely, to hike back toward the road and forget I'd ever seen the place. But I didn't. I set my pack down and sat on a log, trying to calm myself. My mind kept circling back to the tally marks on the table and the stain on the floor. Someone had lived there, kept track of something, days maybe, or people, and then something bad had happened. Bad enough to leave blood soaking into the floorboards. As daylight started to fade, the clearing grew darker faster than the woods around it. I couldn't stop staring at the cabin. The open door looked black, like a mouth. I told myself I wasn't scared, just unsettled, but I knew the truth. I was scared. I was alone, miles from anyone, and I had found a place that carried too much weight of whatever had happened there. I decided I wasn't going to spend the night anywhere near it. I gathered my gear and started hiking back the way I had come. Every few minutes I turned to check behind me, half expecting to see movement among the trees, but there was never anything. The woods grew darker, and I had to use my headlamp, the beam cutting a narrow tunnel of light in front of me. It took me nearly 3 hours to reach the wider logging road again. By then it was full night, cold air seeping into my jacket. I kept walking until I reached a spot where I felt far enough from the cabin that I could set up my tent. Even then, I barely slept. Every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves jolted me awake. The next morning, with daylight making the forest seem less heavy, I thought about going back to look one more time. Curiosity gnawed at me, but I knew if I did, I might find something I really didn't want to see. Old bones, tools, or worse. So I forced myself to keep moving, to follow the road until I reached my car parked miles away at the trailhead. When I finally drove back to town, the weight in my chest eased, but the image of that cabin stayed sharp in my mind. The tallies on the table, the stain on the floor, the silence of the clearing, all of it felt burned into me. I never reported it to anyone. I thought about it, but what would I even say? That I found an old cabin with some scratches and a dark patch on the floor? It would sound like nothing like my imagination, but I knew what I saw. Even now, years later, I can still picture the door hanging open, waiting. I never went back, and I never will. Some places, once you've seen them, you understand they're better left alone. That cabin is one of them. I was 27 in the summer of 1996 when I decided to spend a week alone on my uncle's old farm cabin in southern Iowa. He had passed away the year before, and the place hadn't been lived in since. My mother asked me to go out there to check on it, see what kind of shape it was in, maybe clear out some things and make sure nobody had broken in. The cabin had always felt isolated when I was younger, but I remembered it with a kind of fondness. Wide fields, the smell of corn, the sound of cicadas in the evenings. It had been years since I'd last set foot there. The drive from Des Moines took about 3 hours. The farther I went, the narrower the roads got, until they turned to cracked asphalt lined by endless rows of corn. The sun beat down hard, and the air carried that heavy, dusty warmth that seemed to cling to everything in midsummer. When I finally pulled onto the dirt path that led to the cabin, My car kicked up a long trail of dust behind me. I rolled the window down, smelled the dry earth, and for a moment it felt peaceful. The cabin looked just as I remembered it, though a bit more tired. The wooden siding was weathered, the roof sagged slightly, and weeds had grown tall around the porch steps. A rusted-out pickup sat on the side of the barn across the field, exactly where my uncle had parked it years ago when the engine died. I cut the ignition, and the silence that followed was startling. No cars, no voices, nothing but the faint buzz of insects. Inside, the cabin smelled like old wood and mildew. Dust coated the furniture, and cobwebs stretched across the corners of the windows. The place had clearly been left alone for a long time. I set my bag on the kitchen counter, walked through each room, and checked the doors and windows. They were still locked, no sign of forced entry. That reassured me a little. I spent the first day cleaning, sweeping the floor, airing out the rooms, and clearing debris from the porch. The sun dipped lower, turning the fields gold, and by the time night fell, I was exhausted. I lit a kerosene lamp, sat at the small table, and ate a can of soup. The silence of the countryside at night is different from city silence. It's not just quiet. It's heavy, thick, as if the dark itself is pressing against the cabin walls. I remember feeling the weight of it as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the chirps and rustles outside. The next morning, I walked out toward the barn to take a better look. The doors groaned as I pulled them open. Inside, it smelled of hay, dust, and rusting tools. Wooden ladders leaned against the walls, and an old workbench was littered with empty jars, nails, and rope. The place had an unsettling emptiness to it, as though someone had just stepped out and might come back any second. I stayed only long enough to look around before stepping back into the sunlight. On the third evening, things started to feel wrong. I had been sitting on the porch as the sun went down, drinking a bottle of water and watching the tree line. A breeze had picked up, carrying with it the faint creak of something metal. It sounded like a gate or loose sheet of tin, but I couldn't place it. I walked the perimeter of the cabin, checked the barn again, but nothing seemed out of place. When I sat back down, the sound came again, faint but distinct, like something moving out there. That night, I had trouble sleeping. Around midnight, I heard it, a faint crunch of gravel near the cabin. My body went rigid in bed. I told myself it was probably an animal, a raccoon, or stray dog. But then it came again, slower, heavier, like footsteps. I didn't move. I just lay there, staring at the shadows on the ceiling, heart hammering in my chest. After a long while, the sound faded. I eventually drifted off, but the unease stuck with me. The following day, I found something strange. Out behind the barn, near the edge of the cornfield, the dirt had fresh tracks, boot prints pressed deep into the ground. They weren't mine. I had only been walking around the cabin and barn. These led in from the field, stopped near the barn door, and then turned back the way they came. I crouched down, traced the edges with my fingers. The prints were clear, recent, maybe from the night before. My stomach tightened. The farm was isolated, the nearest neighbor at least 2 miles down the road. Nobody had any reason to be out there. I tried to rationalize it. Maybe hunters, maybe kids messing around, though it seemed unlikely. Still, I spent the day on edge, glancing at the tree line, listening for movement. That night, I barricaded the front door with a chair and kept the lamp burning low. Hours crawled by. Around 2 in the morning, I heard the crunch of gravel again. This time it was closer, slow, deliberate. My skin prickled as I sat up in bed, straining to listen. Then, a creak from the porch boards, right outside the door. Someone was standing there. I held my breath, waiting, every muscle tense. After what felt like forever, the sound shifted, soft steps moving away, fading into the distance. The next morning, I checked the porch. Sure enough, The dust on the boards showed clear outlines of boots. Whoever it was had been only feet from where I slept. My hands shook as I traced them with my eyes. I wanted to leave then, pack my bag and drive back to the city, but something stubborn in me wanted to finish what I came for. I told myself I'd stay one more night, then head home. I kept a hammer close, the only thing I could find that felt like a weapon. I checked all the doors and windows again, made sure they were locked tight, and sat up late listening. Near 3 in the morning, the sounds came back. This time, they circled the cabin. Gravel crunching, then silence, then a faint brush against the siding. My chest tightened. Whoever it was, they were testing, waiting, maybe trying to see if I'd come out. I gripped the hammer so hard my hand ached. After an hour, the sounds faded again. When dawn came, I packed my bag without hesitation. I locked the cabin behind me and walked quickly to my car. As I turned onto the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. Across the field, just at the edge of the corn, I thought I saw movement. A figure standing still, watching. I didn't slow down. I drove straight back to Des Moines, heart pounding the entire way. I never went back to that cabin. My mother eventually sold the property, and I was glad when she did. Sometimes, though, I think about those boot prints, about the slow, deliberate footsteps outside my door at night. Whoever that was, they weren't lost and they weren't curious. They knew I was there. They wanted me to know they were there. And I left before I found out what would have happened if I'd stayed one night longer. I was 29 when I decided to spend a weekend alone in a cabin I had rented deep in the woods of northern Wisconsin in 2014. I had been working long hours at a warehouse job, and I wanted silence, away from the noise of trucks, forklifts, and people yelling orders all day. A friend of mine told me about an old hunting cabin that he and his father used to stay at years back, and he gave me the number of the owner. It wasn't the kind of polished rental people booked online. It was more like a forgotten structure that the owner was happy to make a little money from by renting it out to anyone willing to make the trip. The drive took most of the afternoon. By the time I reached the dirt road that led to the cabin, the sun was starting to set behind the tall pine trees. The road was rough, full of potholes and loose gravel. I drove slowly, feeling the car shift and bounce as branches brushed against the windows. When I finally saw the cabin, it was smaller than I expected. Just a single-story structure with a metal roof that looked rusted in patches. The wood siding was dark and weathered, and the small porch sagged a little. I parked near a tree line, grabbed my bag, and went inside. The air inside smelled like old wood and dust, and the temperature dropped noticeably compared to outside. The place had only the basics: a small table, 2 wooden chairs, a narrow bed with a thin mattress, and a wood stove for heat. The windows were small and had no curtains, which made the inside feel exposed once the darkness outside thickened. That first night, I cooked a can of soup on a small camping stove I had brought with me and ate in silence, listening to the woods. I thought I would feel calm out there, but the silence wasn't peaceful. It was heavy, and it made every small sound stand out sharply. Branches snapping, leaves shifting, and the occasional rustle that felt too deliberate to be just the wind. I told myself it was animals, deer or raccoons. When I finally tried to sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone could be standing just outside the cabin, looking in through the glass. The bed was pushed against the wall, and I lay with my back pressed against the logs, staring at the window across the room. My eyes kept flicking there, expecting to see a face. I must have drifted off sometime past midnight because when I opened my eyes again, pale light was coming in. The second day, I hiked around the woods, trying to shake the unease. The forest stretched endlessly, pine needles covering the ground in thick layers that muffled my footsteps. I walked for hours, but the trees always looked the same, and I kept checking over my shoulder. At one point, I saw an old rusted pickup truck, abandoned in a clearing. Its windows were shattered, and weeds had grown around the tires. I stood there staring at it for a while, wondering how long it had been sitting out there and who had left it. By late afternoon, clouds rolled in and the woods grew darker than usual. I made it back to the cabin and lit the lantern I had brought. The storm broke not long after, rain pounding against the roof, water dripping down through tiny gaps where the metal sheets had separated. The sound of it masked the usual forest noises, but it also made me more anxious. I couldn't hear what was outside anymore. That night, around 2 a.m, I woke up to a different sound. It wasn't the rain or the wind. It was footsteps on the porch. Slow, deliberate steps, the wood creaking under the weight. My chest tightened, and I lay perfectly still, straining to listen. After a few moments, the sound stopped, but I didn't hear the steps move away. It was as if whoever was out there was standing still, just a few feet from the door. I stared at the dark outline of the door, my body rigid. I didn't move for nearly an hour, my ears burning from the effort of trying to catch any sound. Eventually, I told myself it had to be the storm playing tricks, the wood shifting with the rain. Somehow, I fell asleep again, though it was a shallow, restless sleep. In the morning, I stepped out onto the porch. The rain had stopped, but the air was damp and cold. I looked down and froze. On the wet wood of the porch were clear prints, boot prints, not animal tracks. They were smeared and uneven, but it was clear someone had been there. The prints led up to the door and then back down the steps. My stomach dropped as I followed them a little way into the dirt. The tracks vanished into the trees. The rest of that day, I couldn't relax. Every sound in the woods made me tense. I didn't go far, just stayed near the cabin, checking the tree line over and over. By evening, I decided I couldn't stay another night. I didn't want to be in that cabin when the dark came again, not after seeing those prints. But when I went to start my car, it wouldn't turn over. I tried again and again, pumping the gas, but the engine made only weak clicking sounds. My phone barely had any service, just one bar flickering in and out, not enough to make a call. That night was worse than the last. I barricaded the door with one of the chairs and sat up most of the night with the lantern lit, clutching the heavy flashlight I had packed. My eyes kept darting to the windows. At some point, I thought I saw movement out there, just a shape shifting between the trees, but I couldn't be sure. The lantern hissed quietly, and the smell of kerosene filled the room. My heart pounded so hard I felt it in my throat. Around 3 a.m, I heard the footsteps again. This time, they circled the cabin. Slow, steady, crunching in the wet ground and occasionally thudding on the porch. I sat frozen, my hands gripping the flashlight so hard my fingers ached. I didn't breathe until the steps faded back into the trees. When the sky finally lightened, I didn't wait. I grabbed my bag, left the cabin as it was, and started walking down the dirt road in the direction I had come from 2 days earlier. I walked for hours, my head jerking at every sound in the woods, expecting to see someone following. Eventually, a truck came down the road, and I flagged it down. The driver, an older man, let me climb in the back, and he dropped me off at a small gas station miles away. I never went back for the car. I called the cabin owner later from home, and he told me he'd have it towed. I didn't explain what had happened. I just said I had to leave early. For weeks after, I couldn't sleep well. Every night, I'd jolt awake, sure I was hearing those same slow footsteps circling outside my apartment window. Even now, years later, I still think about that cabin. I don't know who was out there in the woods with me or why they came up onto that porch in the middle of the night. Maybe it was some drifter, maybe a hunter who stumbled across the place. But I know what I heard, and I know what I saw. Someone had been there, and they wanted me to know it. I was 31 years old when I decided to take a trip out to a hunting cabin I had only been to once before. It was tucked away deep in the woods of northern Wisconsin, far enough from the nearest town that you could go days without hearing a single engine or seeing another person. I had borrowed the place from a man I knew through work, someone who said he hadn't been up there in years but kept the deed because his father had built it in the 70s. The cabin wasn't much, just a single-room log structure with a small wood stove, a bunk, and a table, but I liked the idea of being alone for a while, away from everything. It was mid-November of 2016, deer season, and I figured it would be a chance to clear my head, hunt a bit, and get used to being in silence again. The drive itself was slow and rough. The old truck I had rattled more than it should, and by the time I turned off the last paved road and onto the trail leading into the forest, the air had a bite to it. The sky was gray and heavy, the kind that felt like it could snow at any minute. The path to the cabin was barely wide enough for the truck, with branches scraping the sides as I pushed deeper into the woods. It felt endless, and when I finally reached the small clearing where the cabin sat, I was relieved to see the roofline peeking through the trees. The place was exactly as I remembered it. The logs were dark with age, the small porch sagged a little, and the single window was clouded over from inside. I had to put my shoulder into the door to get it open, and the smell that came out was a mix of old wood, dust, and the faint mustiness of being shut tight for too many seasons. There was a chill inside that felt different from the cold outdoors. I dropped my gear by the bunk, pulled the tarp off the stack of firewood on the porch, and got a fire going in the stove. It took a while before the air lost its bite, but soon the place felt bearable. That first night was uneventful. I unpacked my rifle, checked over the few supplies I had brought, ate a can of beans straight from the tin, and sat listening to the stove crackle. Outside, the woods were quiet, almost too quiet, the kind of silence where your ears strain for a sound and get nothing. I turned in early, the bunk creaking under me, and drifted in and out of sleep, waking now and then to the popping of the stove. The next morning I rose before dawn and set out into the trees with my rifle. The forest was thick, the undergrowth damp, and every step seemed too loud in the stillness. I didn't see much, just a few tracks in the mud and some movement far off that vanished before I could line up a shot. By mid-morning, I gave up and circled back to the cabin. That's when I noticed something that didn't sit right with me. There were boot prints near the clearing, pressed into the soft ground. At first, I thought they were mine from the day before, but as I looked closer, I realized they weren't. They were fresh, sharper at the edges, and they came from the woods on the opposite side of where I had walked in. The prints led toward the cabin and then seemed to stop just short of the porch. I stood there staring at them for longer than I should have, trying to convince myself they might be old, but the ground was too soft for them to have lasted more than a day. Someone had been here, probably while I was inside the woods that morning. I felt the hair on the back of my neck rise. The cabin was far enough off the beaten track that no one should have been wandering by casually. I stepped inside and checked my things, but nothing seemed out of place. Still, the thought of someone being close enough to walk right up to the cabin made my stomach knot. I closed the door tighter, slid the old metal latch, and sat at the table staring out the window for a long while. That night was harder. The wind picked up, rattling the branches against the roof, and every sound seemed sharper, closer. I couldn't shake the image of those boot prints in the dirt. I told myself it was a hunter passing through, maybe lost, maybe curious, but the prints had stopped near the porch and hadn't gone farther. Whoever it was had come close, then turned back. I lay awake on the bunk, my rifle leaned against the wall within reach. The fire in the stove burned down low, and the shadows in the cabin seemed to shift with every flicker. The following morning, I stepped out to get more wood and froze. There were more prints, fresh again, circling the clearing this time. They weren't in a straight line. They looped around the cabin, came up toward the back, and stopped near the small window. Whoever it was had been close again, and this time while I was asleep inside. I didn't eat breakfast. My stomach was too tight. I went around the cabin slowly, following the tracks until they disappeared into the trees. I thought about packing up and leaving right then, but the truck was a long way down the trail, and I told myself I was overreacting. I tried to focus on hunting, but the woods didn't feel the same anymore. Every crack of a twig made me spin, and the silence pressed down harder. By the time the third night came, I couldn't relax at all. I bolted the door, pulled the bunk closer to the stove, and kept the rifle across my chest. Sleep came in short bursts, broken by the smallest noises. At one point, I was sure I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and heavy, but when I forced myself to look, the window was empty and the door stayed closed. At dawn, I decided I'd had enough. I began packing, moving fast, shoving everything into my bag without caring how it fit. I stepped outside with my gear, and the air was colder than ever. Frost covered the clearing, and the prints were back, clearer than before. They led straight up to the door, pressed deep into the frost, and then they turned away toward the woods again. Whoever had been coming by had been there during the night, closer than ever. I didn't waste time. I loaded my gear into the truck, threw the rifle across the seat, and started down the trail. Every bump in the dirt road felt like it took forever, and I kept checking the rearview mirror as if I expected someone to step out of the trees. When I finally hit pavement, I didn't slow down until I reached town. That cabin still sits out there, as far as I know, but I never went back. I don't know who had been circling it, watching, or why they stopped short of coming inside. Maybe it was just someone curious. Maybe someone trying to scare me off, or maybe something worse. I only know that being watched without knowing by who, in a place so far from help, was enough to make me leave everything behind. I never hunted those woods again. I was 34 when I decided to spend a week at my grandmother's old cabin in the countryside of Arkansas. She had passed away the year before, and the property had been sitting empty ever since. The family talked about selling it, but no one ever made the move. It wasn't much more than a wooden box sitting at the edge of a sloping pasture with a line of woods pressing close on the backside. The cabin had no electricity, no running water, and it hadn't been kept up in years, but for some reason I felt drawn to it. Maybe it was because I had spent so many childhood summers there, chasing fireflies and climbing trees while she cooked meals on the wood stove. Or maybe it was because I had been restless in my life lately, tired of the noise of town, tired of the job that wore me down. I drove down a long dirt road until I reached the rusted metal gate that led to the cabin. The weeds had grown so high they scraped the underside of my truck as I pulled through. The grass was yellow and dry, and the wooden posts leaned as if the whole property had started to sag without anyone caring for it. The cabin came into view after a bend in the path. It looked smaller than I remembered. The roof shingles had curled up and the porch boards looked like they could snap if I stepped wrong. One of the windows was cracked. I parked beside the shed, which was half collapsed, and got out. The air smelled like dry hay and dust. Cicadas buzzed from the trees. For a moment I felt a strange unease, as if I was stepping onto land that didn't want me there anymore. I shook it off and carried my bags inside. The cabin smelled the same way it always had, a mixture of old wood, dust, and faint smoke from the stove. A layer of grime covered the counters, and spider webs stretched from the beams. I opened all the windows to let in the hot air. I set my sleeping bag on the bed that sagged in the middle and swept the floor with the old broom still leaning in the corner. The place felt empty in a way that bothered me. I was used to remembering my grandmother's voice in the kitchen, the clatter of her pans, the small radio she kept on the shelf. Now there was nothing but creaking boards. That first night, I cooked a can of beans over the stove and ate outside on the porch while the sun set. The woods behind the cabin looked darker than usual, as if the trees had grown thicker since the last time I was here. The sound of crickets came in waves, and every so often I thought I heard something heavier moving in the brush. A deer, I told myself. But when full darkness came, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I didn't sleep well. The cabin groaned with the night air, and every creak made me sit up and listen. At one point, I was sure I heard footsteps on the porch, slow and careful as if someone was testing the boards. My chest tightened, and I sat up straight in bed, staring at the door. I waited, barely breathing, but the sound faded and didn't come back. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a raccoon, and finally lay back down, though I didn't close my eyes for a long time. The next morning, I walked the property. The pasture grass was waist-high, and I had to push through it to get to the tree line. There were trails cut through the weeds, narrow paths where something had walked repeatedly. Some were low, like deer trails, but others looked wider, like a person had been moving back and forth. I crouched down and saw shoe prints in the dirt. They were faint, but they were there, pressed into the softer patches of soil. The tread was not from a boot, but from sneakers. That unsettled me. No one was supposed to be out here. The nearest neighbor was nearly 3 miles away. The rest of the day, I tried to stay busy. I cleaned the inside of the cabin, gathered firewood, and even fixed one of the porch steps that had rotted through. I tried to convince myself that the tracks were old, maybe left by a hunter years ago. But as the sun went down again, I noticed something else. Across the field, near the edge of the trees, a thin curl of smoke rose into the sky. It was faint but steady, as if someone had a small fire going. I stood on the porch for a long time, staring at that smoke. My grandmother's land stretched a good distance back, and no one had permission to camp on it. I thought about walking over there, but the light was fading fast, and the idea of stepping into those woods made me uneasy. I decided I would look in the morning. That night was worse than the first. Around midnight, I woke up to the sound of something scraping against the outside wall. Not clawing, but dragging like metal against wood. I held my breath, listening. Then came a soft thud, like someone bumping into the porch railing. My skin prickled. I reached for the flashlight I had set on the crate by the bed and turned it on. The beam lit the small room, but it did nothing for the sounds outside. I didn't want to open the door. I just sat there with the flashlight in my hand, waiting. After a long while, the noises stopped, but I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I found marks on the wall near the back window. Thin, sharp grooves cut into the wood. They looked fresh, the shavings still curled at the bottom of the wall. I also saw footprints in the dirt near the porch, clearer this time and newer. Whoever was out here had been close to the cabin while I slept. I decided to walk to where I had seen the smoke. I followed the field to the trees and stepped into the woods. The air was damp and cool under the shade. After about 100 yards, I found a small clearing. In the center was a fire pit made of stones, still warm. A few charred sticks lay inside, and next to it was a torn backpack with some empty food wrappers stuffed inside. There was also a rusted kitchen knife lying on a log. A chill went through me. Someone was living back here, not just passing through, actually camping on the property, close enough to watch the cabin. I backed away slowly, feeling every sound of my footsteps as too loud. For the rest of the day, I couldn't settle. Every time I stepped onto the porch, I scanned the woods, half expecting to see someone standing there. As evening came, I made the decision that I couldn't stay another night. Something about the situation was wrong. Whoever was out there wasn't just trespassing. They had been circling the cabin, scratching at the walls, and walking on the porch. That wasn't the behavior of someone harmless. I packed my bag before dark, loaded it into the truck, and sat behind the wheel for a long moment. The cabin looked small and tired in the fading light. I thought about my grandmother, about how safe the place had always felt when she was alive. Now it was only wood and silence, watched by someone I couldn't see. As I drove down the dirt road, I checked the mirror. For a split second, I thought I saw movement at the edge of the trees near the cabin. A figure, still and thin, standing where the woods met the field. But the road dipped and I lost sight of it. By the time I reached the highway, the tension in my chest finally eased. I knew then I wouldn't go back, not alone. Whatever was out there had been too close, too quiet, and too deliberate. The cabin would remain part of my memory of my grandmother, but the place itself didn't belong to me anymore. It belonged to the silence, the woods, and whoever had decided to live in its shadows. I never thought I would step foot near that cabin again. Not after everything that happened in my life and not after my ex-husband passed away. His name was Mark. He was 51 when he died. Sudden heart failure, no warning at all. We had been divorced for almost 6 years by then, but there was still a strange tie between us because of that old cabin he had bought back when we were married. It sat in the hills of northern Michigan, off a dirt road that grew rougher the deeper you went. The place had always been half refuge, half curse, and I had spent many cold nights there when we were younger, back before our lives took separate paths. After his funeral in 2019, his brother called me about the cabin. He said it was still in my name too, since Mark had never changed the paperwork after the divorce. I hadn't seen it in more than a decade, but something inside me felt pulled back. Maybe I wanted to face what I had left behind. Maybe I just needed to see it one last time before I made the decision to sell it. Either way, 2 weeks later I was driving up north, a bag packed in the trunk, the tires crunching on long-forgotten roads as I headed toward that place I swore I'd never return to. The land around the cabin hadn't changed much. Pines still grew thick on either side of the path, and the dirt road twisted until I almost forgot where I was going. When I finally reached the clearing, the sight made me stop and just sit in the car for a few minutes. The cabin looked worse than I remembered. The roof sagged slightly on the left side, shingles missing. Moss had spread over the wooden siding like green scars, and the porch steps looked as though they could collapse under my weight. The windows were covered in grime, and one of the shutters hung crooked, banging lightly in the wind. It felt like staring at a piece of my own past that had rotted away. I got out of the car and the air smelled like wet earth and pine needles. The cabin door stuck when I tried to push it open, the wood swollen from years of moisture. Inside it was colder than outside, damp and heavy with dust. The furniture was still in place, though covered in sheets of dirt and spiderwebs. The table where Mark used to clean his hunting rifles was piled with old magazines, warped from moisture. The couch cushions sagged, stained dark in places. I ran my hand over the countertop and came away with a layer of dust thick as powder. For a while, I just wandered through the rooms, touching things, noticing how much smaller the cabin felt than it used to. Back then, it had seemed wide open, almost endless when we filled it with food and laughter. Now it was cramped, dark, and the air pressed in on me like it wanted me gone. I checked the small bedroom we once shared. The bed frame was still there, though the mattress had long since molded, a foul smell rising from it. I opened the closet and found some of Mark's old clothes still hanging, flannel shirts stiff with age, boots on the floor hardened with dirt. It struck me how quickly life turns into leftover objects when someone's gone. I planned to spend the night even though the thought unsettled me. I had brought a sleeping bag and some supplies. The place had no running water anymore, no working electricity, but I had lanterns, food, and a heavy blanket. As evening came, rain began to fall against the roof, steady at first and then harder. The sound echoed through the cabin, dripping through a hole in the ceiling into a rusted pan someone had left years ago. I tried to read, tried to keep myself occupied, but the storm grew heavier and the wind whistled through cracks in the walls. Every creak of the old wood made me tense. I remembered how Mark used to say the forest around here always seemed to have eyes on it, like something out there didn't want people staying too long. He said it as a joke, but now, sitting there alone with only a lantern burning, I didn't find it funny. Around midnight, I decided to try to sleep. I rolled out my sleeping bag on the floor in the main room since the bedroom smelled too rotten to use. The lantern light flickered, casting strange shapes against the walls. I lay there listening to the storm, but every little noise stood out. The tapping of branches, the groan of the wood beams, and once, a sound like footsteps just outside. My heart jumped at that, but when I strained my ears, the only thing I could hear was the rain. I must have dozed off, because when I opened my eyes, the lantern had burned out. The room was pitch dark, the kind of black where you can't see your own hand. Then I heard it, clear as day this time, the sound of something brushing against the porch. Slow, careful movements, not the random thump of branches. I froze, holding my breath, waiting. The sound came again, the soft crunch of weight on the porch boards. I reached for the flashlight I had beside me and clicked it on. The beam cut through the dark, catching dust swirling in the air. I aimed it at the window, but all I saw was the rain dripping down the glass. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone was out there, standing just beyond the edge of light. I sat up, heart pounding, and listened so hard my ears ached. The sound had stopped. The hours dragged on after that. Every time I closed my eyes, I felt the weight of the silence pressing on me. At some point, exhaustion won. When I woke again, it was morning, pale light slipping through the cracks of the blinds. The rain had stopped, leaving the forest wet and heavy. I stood, stiff from the hard floor, and went to the front door. That's when I saw the porch. Muddy footprints trailed across it, leading from the steps to the front door and back again. Not animal prints, not random marks from the rain, but the clear shape of boots. Someone had walked right up to the cabin in the middle of the night and then walked away. I stood there staring for a long time, the quiet of the morning louder than the storm had been. Whoever it was hadn't tried to break in, hadn't knocked, hadn't said a word. They had just come close enough to let me know they were there. I packed up fast after that. My hands shook as I stuffed the sleeping bag and lantern into the car. I didn't even bother closing the door of the cabin properly behind me. Driving back down that dirt road, I kept looking in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone standing in the trees. By the time I reached the highway, the cabin was out of sight, swallowed by the woods, but the image of those muddy footprints burned into my mind. I knew I wasn't coming back. The cabin wasn't just a piece of my past anymore. It was a warning. Whatever had been out there in the night hadn't needed to hurt me to make its point. I signed the papers to sell it a month later. I never asked who bought it. All I know is that I'll never drive that way again, and if I do, I won't look at the tree line. Some places carry too much weight, too many shadows of the living, and too many reminders that sometimes the scariest thing isn't what's inside the cabin. It's what waits quietly outside, watching. I was 27 years old in the summer of 2006 when I worked as a seasonal park ranger in a national forest in northern Idaho. They gave me a small one-room cabin near the edge of the park, far from the main station where the other rangers stayed. The cabin was old, built in the 1940s, with dark wooden walls and a tin roof that popped when the sun hit it. It sat in a clearing with thick pines crowding the back and a narrow dirt road leading down to it from the main trail. The cabin had one bed, a little iron stove, a table, and a radio that was supposed to reach the tower miles away, though the signal was weak most of the time. I had been excited at first, thinking I would get quiet nights, but after a few weeks, the silence of the place felt heavier than I thought it would. Most of my job was patrolling the nearby trails, checking for illegal campsites, watching for fires, and making sure hikers signed in at the entry points. By late July, the days were hot and dry, the kind of weather where you worried about a single cigarette but sparking a hillside blaze. I spent long afternoons hiking ridges and circling back to the cabin at dusk. I kept my gear lined against the wall. A pack, a hatchet, my boots, a flashlight, and a pair of binoculars. The cabin creaked with every step, and at night the forest pressed right up against it, so thick I could hear branches tapping the roof when the wind shifted. One night it started with a call over the radio, a faint message that crackled so bad I could barely make out the words. Something about a possible fire, smoke sighted near the South Ridge. I grabbed my gear and went out with my flashlight even though the sky had already gone dark. I hiked uphill through the trees, listening hard for the crackle of flames, but there was nothing.
No smoke, no glow.
I stayed out for hours, circling, and finally came back down near midnight. The cabin sat there in the clearing, the windows black squares in the pale moonlight. It looked smaller than ever, like it was shrinking into the earth. When I went inside, something felt different. The bed was the same, the table in the same spot, but I noticed the lantern had been moved from the shelf to the floor. I told myself I probably kicked it earlier without noticing, but I couldn't shake the feeling. I set it back and tried to sleep. Every sound outside came sharp through the walls, the snap of branches, the rustle of leaves. I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling. The next day, I walked the South Ridge again and checked for signs of campers or fire. Nothing. When I returned that evening, the cabin door was unlocked. I always kept it latched. Inside, the lantern was on the floor again, and one of my boots was turned on its side. I checked every corner of the cabin, looked under the bed, opened the little closet. No one was there. The window by the bed had been cracked open half an inch, though I never opened it because the bugs came in. I locked it tight, latched the door, and told myself to stay calm. The cabin had only one key, and it was on my belt. That night was worse. Around 2 a.m, I woke to the sound of footsteps outside. Slow, heavy steps circling the cabin in the dirt. I sat up in bed, heart racing, and killed the lantern. The steps went all the way around, crunching in the gravel, then stopped by the front door. I waited in silence, every muscle tight, listening. The handle rattled once, faint but clear, then nothing. I stayed awake until the first light came through the trees, gripping the hatchet I kept by the bed. In the morning, I walked the clearing and found shoe prints in the dirt. Not boots like mine, but sneakers, narrow tread. They circled the cabin, stopped at the door, then led back into the woods. I followed them 50 yards before they vanished into the pine needles. No vehicle tracks, no bike, nothing else. I thought about reporting it, but the radio barely worked, and I knew the main office was hours away. I told myself it was probably some hiker messing around, though it didn't explain the things moved inside. The following nights, I tried to stay calm. I kept the lantern burning, left the hatchet on the table within reach, and double-latched the door. For 2 nights, nothing happened. Then on the third, I woke again to noise. This time it wasn't footsteps, it was breathing. Right outside the window near my bed, slow and heavy. The kind you could hear even over the crickets. I froze in place, afraid to move. The window was only a foot from my head, thin glass separating me from whoever was there. After a minute, the breathing stopped. I forced myself to stand and look outside with the flashlight, but the beam only caught the trees. The ground was bare. I barely slept the rest of the night. By then, I knew someone had been coming around. I started checking the locks 2 and 3 times, dragging the table against the door when I lay down to sleep. During the day, I searched the woods more carefully, walking deeper than before. On one hike, I found a pile of cigarette butts near a fallen log, still fresh, though smoking was banned in the park because of fire danger. Next to them was a scrap of plastic torn from a grocery bag. I took it back to the cabin and set it on the table. Whoever was out there had been staying close. On the last night, it came to a head. I had been sitting at the table writing in my logbook when I heard the faintest scrape at the back wall, like nails or a knife dragging on wood. My skin went cold. I blew out the lantern and sat still in the dark, listening. The scraping went on for a few seconds, then stopped. A minute later, footsteps again, this time quicker, moving around the cabin. The door rattled harder than before. I grabbed the hatchet and pressed myself against the far wall. The handle shook twice, then went still. Then I heard the creak of the roof as if someone had climbed onto it. Dust fell from the ceiling boards. I backed into the corner, heart pounding, staring up at the roof. It went on for nearly an hour, shifts in weight above me, faint scuffs, then silence. At last, I heard the thud of someone jumping back down and the crunch of steps fading into the forest. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the hatchet until my hand cramped. At dawn, I forced myself outside and walked the clearing. Clear shoe prints again, circling, leading to the back where the wall had fresh scratches carved into it. I looked up and saw marks along the edge of the roof, where a boot had slipped on the tin. I packed my gear that morning, stuffed everything into my pack, and left the cabin behind. I hiked the dirt road out, carrying the hatchet in my hand the whole way until I reached the ranger station near noon. I filed a full report, wrote down everything I saw, showed them the cigarette butts and the prints. They said they would check it out, maybe send someone to stay there. But I knew I wouldn't go back. The cabin was too far out, too quiet, too easy for someone to circle at night without being caught. Whoever had been there knew I was alone, and they had been testing the place night after night, coming closer, climbing higher, seeing how much they could get away with. I thought about how close that window was to my head and how thin the glass was. I finished the season working closer to the main camp, where other rangers were around. But even then, I slept light, listening for footsteps in the dirt. I never returned to that cabin in Idaho. I was 32 years old in the fall of 2016 when I decided to spend a few weeks alone on a piece of land I had bought years earlier in the hills of northern Arkansas. It was nothing special, just a few acres of mixed hardwood and pine, but I wanted to build a small cabin there by myself, away from people and the constant noise of town. I had saved up money for lumber and brought along a tent, a cooler of food, some tools, and a little wood stove I had gotten secondhand. The plan was simple: spend my days cutting, measuring, and hammering, and my nights resting under the sound of wind moving through the trees. I thought it would be peaceful, but I learned quickly how different the woods felt when the rain came, especially at night, and how much your own mind can turn against you when you're alone and everything feels just a little off. The first few days went smoothly. I cleared an area not far from a narrow dirt trail that wound through the property. The soil was damp and dark, filled with roots, but I managed to level a spot for the cabin. I was only building a one-room place, nothing big, just enough for a bed, a table, and maybe a shelf. I cut and measured the floor beams and set them on cinder blocks I had hauled up in the bed of my truck. By the end of the third day, I had the floor down and some of the wall frames standing. The work was slow but steady, and I was proud of how it was coming along. The weather turned on the fourth day. A front moved in from the west, heavy with rain and wind. The air grew thick and damp, and the sky stayed low and gray. I kept working under the drizzle until it turned into a steady downpour, forcing me to cover the lumber with tarps and retreat to my tent. I sat there listening to the rain hammering against the nylon, the sound of it drumming on leaves, dripping down branches, and forming streams in the soil outside. The woods looked darker than usual, even though it was only late afternoon. I felt closed in, the trees pressing tight around me. That night, I couldn't sleep much. The rain never let up. Water pooled under the tent and the ground turned soft and uneven. My sleeping bag was damp around the edges, and every time I started to doze off, a sharp gust of wind would rattle the trees, and I would hear branches snap in the distance. Once, I thought I heard footsteps outside, moving slowly around the worksite, crunching on wet leaves. I told myself it was just the rain dripping in heavy drops, or maybe a raccoon nosing around. But the sound came again, steady and deliberate, circling the tent before fading into the downpour. I lay completely still, holding my breath, waiting for it to return, but it didn't. By morning, the ground was a mess. Mud sucked at my boots with every step, and water streamed across the flattened spot where the cabin stood. I tried to get back to work, but the rain was relentless, and the wood was soaked. Nails slipped in my fingers, and every hammer strike seemed louder in the heavy, wet air. I felt like I was being watched, though I couldn't see anything except trees bending in the wind and sheets of rain moving between them. That evening, I dragged my tools under the cabin floor where it was a little drier. Then I sat on an overturned bucket, just listening. My stomach felt tight, like something wasn't right. The rain made everything blur together. The sound of wind, the sound of water, even the sound of my own footsteps. Every once in a while, I caught myself turning sharply, certain that I had heard movement just past the tree line, something heavier than an animal. But when I looked, there was nothing but the shifting gray curtain of rain. I tried to eat, but my appetite was gone. The can of beans I opened felt heavy in my stomach after only a few bites. I decided I needed to get some real rest, but sleeping in the tent again seemed unbearable. The ground was saturated, and the tent sagged under the weight of water pooling on top of it. So I climbed up onto the cabin floor and unrolled my sleeping bag on the damp boards. It wasn't comfortable, but at least I was off the ground. The rain kept falling, and as darkness settled in, the air grew colder. The woods sounded different at night in the storm, less alive, more hollow. Every creak of a branch or shift of the wind felt sharper, closer. Lying there on the unfinished floor, I listened hard, straining to pick out sounds beyond the rain. Around midnight, I heard something move again. Not the scatter of a raccoon or the light step of a deer, but something dragging, slow and heavy, through the mud near the edge of the clearing. The hair on my arms rose. My first thought was that it could be a black bear, but I had seen no tracks or signs since arriving. The sound stopped for a while, then started again, closer, like someone trudging through the thick, wet leaves. I sat up, heart racing, staring into the darkness. I couldn't see anything except the vague outlines of trees swaying in the storm. Lightning flashed once, bright and sudden, lighting up the clearing. For that split second, I swore I saw something dark standing just beyond the tree line, tall and still, watching. Then the light was gone, and the woods fell black again. I stayed awake the rest of the night, gripping the hammer I had left beside me, every nerve tense. The dragging sound never came close again, but I never forgot how clearly I thought I had seen that figure. When the morning came, gray and wet, I felt drained, weak from lack of sleep. I searched the clearing, but the rain had washed away any tracks that might have been left in the mud. I told myself I had imagined it, that I was just exhausted and jumpy, but the feeling of being watched never left. The rain lasted 2 more days. I worked when I could, but mostly I waited, holed up in the half-finished frame of the cabin, trying to keep things dry. I started to notice little things missing. A box of nails I was sure I had left by the lumber pile was gone. A water bottle I had set near the tent disappeared overnight. I thought maybe I had misplaced them, but deep down I knew I hadn't. On the 7th night, the storm grew worse. The wind roared through the trees, snapping branches and slamming rain sideways against the boards of the cabin. I tried to sleep, but every sound kept me on edge. Then, Sometime in the dead of night, I heard it again, that slow, heavy dragging in the mud, circling just beyond the edge of the clearing. My chest tightened. This time, I didn't wait. I grabbed my flashlight and shined it out into the rain. The beam cut through the downpour in a thin white line, but it landed on nothing. I swung it back and forth, catching only trunks and branches shining wet. Then I spotted something. Fresh gouges in the mud, long and deep, as though something had been dragged along the ground. That was enough for me. By dawn, I had packed my gear, loaded the truck, and thrown a tarp over the unfinished cabin frame. I had come out there to build something, to find some peace, but what I found instead was a reminder of how unforgiving the woods can be, especially when you're alone and the rain never stops. I never saw the figure again, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had been watched every night of that storm. The dragging sound, the missing items, the flash of lightning revealing something tall in the trees. It all stayed with me long after I drove away. I told myself I would come back when the weather was better, when I wasn't so worn down, but I never did. The cabin still sits unfinished on that patch of land, the boards warped and gray from years of rain, the frame leaning against the weight of time. And every time I think about going back, I remember that storm, that dragging sound in the dark, and I decide against it. I was 34 years old when I decided to spend a week alone in an old hunting cabin tucked deep in the northern part of Montana. The cabin wasn't mine, but it belonged to an old friend of my late father, and I had been told I could use it whenever I wanted. It had been years since anyone had stayed there, and part of me just wanted the quiet, a stretch of time without the constant sound of cars, voices, and buzzing phones. I wanted the kind of silence that you only get when you are miles away from anything else. The drive up there took most of the day. The dirt road narrowed until it was barely wide enough for my truck, and branches scraped the sides as I climbed farther into the woods. By the time I pulled up to the small clearing where the cabin sat, the sun was already dropping low, and the sky had that pale orange glow that meant darkness wasn't far off. The cabin was small, made of old weathered logs that looked like they'd been holding each other up for far too long. The porch sagged slightly, and the tin roof had patches of rust. Still, it looked solid enough. Inside, the place smelled like dust and damp wood. There was one main room with a wood stove, a table, and a single bed pushed against the wall. A few old pots hung from hooks, and there were shelves lined with jars of nails, screws, and other little things people collect over years of patching up a place. I set my gear down, lit a lantern, and started sweeping out the dead leaves and dirt that had blown in through the cracks. That first night, I slept heavy. I remember waking only once to the sound of wind moving through the trees, a deep, hollow sound that carried through the walls. I listened for a while, thinking about how far I was from anyone else. No other cabins. No cell service, just trees, mountains, and animals. That thought both comforted me and unsettled me at the same time. The next morning, I spent hours outside, cutting some of the fallen branches for firewood and walking the tree line around the clearing. The woods felt endless, thick with pines that blocked most of the sunlight. Tracks in the mud told me a lot passed through here. Deer, raccoon, maybe a black bear. I kept my rifle close just in case. By the second night, the silence felt different. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It felt heavier, like the woods themselves were watching me. I sat inside with the lantern burning low, reading an old paperback I'd brought, when I heard the first noise. It wasn't the wind or the normal creak of wood. It was a distinct crunch, like someone stepping on dry twigs just outside. My head lifted right away, and I sat still, listening. A few more crunches followed, slow and spaced apart, moving around the cabin. I tried to tell myself it was an animal, maybe a deer nosing around, but the steps were too deliberate. They paused every few seconds like whoever or whatever it was listening to. I didn't move. I sat with my book open but my eyes locked on the wall, waiting. After a while, the sound faded. I didn't hear anything more that night, but I barely slept. The next day, I walked the ground around the cabin, looking for tracks. The soil was soft enough to catch impressions, and I found a few. They weren't animal prints. They were boots. The size looked close to mine. They circled the cabin once and then disappeared back into the woods. My stomach tightened when I saw them. Someone had been out there, walking in the dark, close enough to look through the cracks between the logs. I spent the day unsettled, chopping more wood just to keep busy. Every few minutes I'd stop and listen, half expecting to hear footsteps again. Nothing came, but I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. The woods, once quiet and calm, now felt alive with eyes. That night, I kept the lantern low and the rifle within reach. Hours dragged by, each creak of the cabin making me jump. Around midnight, I heard it again, the crunch of steps. They came slower this time, as if whoever it was knew I was listening. I held my breath and stared at the door. The steps stopped right outside on the porch. The wood of the porch groaned slightly under weight. I didn't move. I didn't even blink. For what felt like forever, there was nothing but silence. Then, slowly, the porch creaked again, and the steps faded away into the woods. Sleep never came after that. I sat in the chair, rifle across my lap, until the first light pushed through the cracks. In the morning, I found fresh boot prints in the damp earth on the porch, clearer than before. Whoever it was had stood there, not moving, for some time. By the fifth day, my nerves were stretched thin. I had barely slept. My eyes felt heavy, and every sound outside made me jump. I thought about packing up and leaving early, but part of me wanted to hold on, to not let fear drive me out. Still, I started keeping the rifle loaded at all times. That night, the footsteps returned, but this time they didn't move slowly. They came fast, circling the cabin, crunching through the leaves, darting from one side to the other. My chest tightened as I realized this wasn't cautious anymore. Whoever it was wanted me to hear them. I stayed low, heart pounding, waiting. The sounds stopped at the door, then silence. I stared so long at the door that my eyes blurred. Suddenly there was a sharp thud, like a hand slapping the wood. Just once, then nothing. No footsteps leaving, no sound at all. I sat frozen until dawn. When morning came, I opened the door carefully. There was a smear of mud across it, like someone had dragged dirty fingers there. The prints around the clearing were a mess, too many to count, circling again and again. My body was stiff with unease as I loaded my truck. I didn't even bother cleaning the cabin or stacking the wood I had cut. I just wanted out. Driving down that dirt road, every shadow between the trees felt like it was hiding something. I kept checking the mirror, half expecting to see someone standing there, watching me leave. Only when the road widened and I reached the highway did I finally feel like I could breathe. I never went back to that cabin. I never even asked the family friend about it. I didn't want to know if he had seen the same thing or if someone else had been using the place without him knowing. All I knew was that someone had been out there, watching me every night, walking circles around me while I sat in that fragile wooden box, alone. And the worst part was knowing they never tried to hide it. They wanted me to know they were there. I had driven nearly 6 hours out of Nashville before turning down the dirt road that led to the cabin. It was the summer of 2012, and I had just turned 30. My body was tired from the years of factory work, and my head was crowded with the noise of bills, deadlines, and the everyday grind. I wanted nothing more than silence, and the old rental cabin in the Tennessee woods seemed like the right choice. It was cheap, tucked far from town, and it promised a lake within walking distance. I packed light, just some clothes, a cooler of food, a folding chair, and a notebook I thought I might fill with thoughts if I got restless. The cabin sat at the end of a rough track that was barely wide enough for my car. The trees pressed in close, tall oaks and pines blocking out the horizon. When I parked in front of it, the place looked more worn down than it had in the pictures. The porch sagged slightly at the corner, and the wood had turned gray from years of weather. The windows were streaked with dirt and pollen. Still, it was standing, and the lock on the door worked. That was all I cared about. The inside smelled of dry wood, dust, and faint mildew. The kitchen had an old electric stove and a small fridge that rattled every few minutes. The living room had a couch with flattened cushions and a rocking chair that groaned when I sat in it. The bedroom was plain, just a bed with a thin mattress and a dresser missing one drawer. I wasn't expecting comfort, though. I wanted solitude. The first day passed quietly. I walked down to the lake in the afternoon. The trail was narrow, winding through thick brush, and the air was heavy with the smell of damp soil. The lake itself was wide and still, the surface broken only by dragonflies and the occasional fish. Nobody else was around. No boats, no swimmers. It was exactly what I had hoped for. By evening, I cooked some canned chili on the stove and sat out on the porch while the sun went down. The woods grew darker and quieter than I had imagined. By the time it was fully night, the only sounds were the chirping of insects and the distant hoot of an owl. The darkness out there felt heavy, like the trees swallowed up all light. I turned in early, laying on the bed with the window cracked open to let in the cool night air. The second night was when things started to feel off. I had been lying in bed, half asleep, when I heard what I thought was the sound of footsteps outside. At first, I brushed it off as some animal. There were plenty of deer and raccoons in those woods, but the steps had a rhythm to them, slow, deliberate crunches on the gravel that led up to the porch. I froze, listening. The sound stopped after a few moments. I waited, heart thumping, but nothing else followed. After 10 minutes of silence, I convinced myself it was nothing and eventually fell asleep. The next morning, though, I noticed something strange near the edge of the porch. The gravel looked disturbed, like someone had scuffed it with a boot. It wasn't a clean footprint, but it wasn't the kind of pattern I'd expect from a deer or other animal. I stood there for a long time staring at it. My stomach knotted. I tried to tell myself it was from me walking around the day before, but I knew it wasn't. I tried not to think about it, but the sense of being watched followed me through the day. Even when I sat at the lake, I kept looking over my shoulder, scanning the tree line. The woods felt different, as if something unseen was moving just out of view. That night, it happened again. I was in bed, the lantern blown out, when I heard the same slow steps. This time they came closer, right up onto the porch. The boards creaked under the weight. I lay completely still, barely breathing. My chest tightened as I listened to the sound of someone, or something, standing just outside the front door. There was no knock, no attempt to come in. Just silence after the creaking stopped. After several minutes, the steps moved again, fading back into the woods. I didn't sleep after that. I lay awake until dawn, straining my ears at every noise. When the first light broke, I opened the door and looked around. The yard was empty, but near the edge of the trees, I saw something that made my throat go dry. A cigarette, but still fresh, lay in the dirt. I hadn't smoked in years, and nobody else should have been there. I thought about leaving right then, packing up and driving back to the city. But something in me refused. Maybe it was pride, or maybe I didn't want to believe I was in any real danger. I told myself it was probably just some drifter passing through. The woods were big enough for hunters, squatters, or whoever. If I ignored it, they'd move on. That's what I told myself. The third night was worse. I stayed up later, sitting in the living room with the lantern burning low. The silence outside pressed against the walls. Around midnight, the sound came again. Footsteps, moving slowly around the cabin. I could hear them circling, crunching in the gravel, snapping a twig here and there. My skin prickled as the steps moved to the back, then to the side, then finally up onto the porch. I held my breath, gripping the armrest of the chair. Then came the soft scrape of metal against the doorknob. The air went out of me. I stared at the door, my heart hammering, watching the shadow of the knob shift slightly as pressure was put on it. Whoever was out there was trying to test if it would open. I stayed frozen, waiting. After what felt like an eternity, the knob stopped moving. Silence filled the room again, broken only by the thump of my pulse in my ears. I waited an hour before daring to move, and even then I didn't sleep. I kept the lantern burning until dawn. When the sun came up, I knew I couldn't stay any longer. I grabbed my bags, threw them in the car, and didn't even bother with breakfast. As I drove back down the dirt road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. At the edge of the trees, near where the track met the main road, I saw a figure standing just inside the shadows. Too far to make out details, but tall with broad shoulders. Watching, I didn't slow down. I didn't stop. By the time I reached the highway, my hands were shaking so bad I had to pull over for a while just to breathe. My mind kept circling the same thought, that whoever it was out there knew the cabin was isolated, that nobody would have heard me if things had gone further. I thought about that cigarette, but about the knob turning in the night, about how close I had been to never making it out. I never went back to that cabin, and I never tried to rent another one in the woods again. Silence was what I thought I wanted, but what I found in that place was something different. Proof that in the quiet, someone else might be listening too, waiting, watching. And if I had stayed just one more night, I don't think I'd be here telling this.